The coin tumbled through the air, catching sunlight as it spun toward the dusty ground of Millbrook's Main Street. Cashin Hartwell's weathered hand snatched it mid-fall, his steel-gray eyes meeting those of the ragged girl who'd been polishing his boots with fierce determination. "Please, just one coin," she'd whispered moments before, her small fingers working the leather with surprising skill. "It ain't for what you think, mister." The towering cowboy studied the child, no more than 10 summers, with tangled auburn hair and a dress patched more than whole. Her eyes held secrets too heavy for someone so young. Around them, the afternoon bustle of Millbrook continued, horses snorting at hitching posts, women in bonnets hurrying between shops, men in dusty work clothes heading toward the saloon. "What's it for then, little sparrow?" Cashin's voice carried the roughness of a man who'd spent years under open skies, but something in the girl's desperate expression softened his tone. Before she could answer, a woman's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "Bexley Thorne, you get away from that stranger this instant." Both Cashin and the girl turned toward the voice. A woman in a faded blue dress stood in the doorway of Millbrook's general store, her dark hair pulled severely back, revealing a face that might have been beautiful if not for the hard lines etched by worry and work. Even from across the street, Cashin could see her hands trembling. "That's my ma," Bexley whispered, scrambling to gather her polishing rags. "She don't understand." "Bexley!" The woman Cashin assumed she was Mrs. Thorne stepped into the street, her skirts swishing with agitated movement. As she drew closer, he noticed the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. The girl clutched Cashin's leg suddenly, pressing the coin back into his palm. "Keep it safe, mister. When the moon's full again, I'll need it back. For the medicine man who comes through. He's the only one who can help her forget the nightmares." Cashin's brow furrowed. "What nightmares, child?" But Bexley was already running toward her mother, leaving behind only the scent of saddle soap and the echo of her cryptic words. As the woman who introduced herself tersely as Cordelia Thorne gathered her daughter protectively, Cashin caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Bruises, dark purple marks, circled Cordelia's wrists like twisted bracelets. And when the wind caught her shawl, he glimpsed more discoloration along her collarbone. "We're sorry to have bothered you, sir," Cordelia said, her voice carefully modulated, each word precise as if she'd rehearsed them. "Bexley sometimes forgets her place." As mother and daughter hurried away, Cashin noticed a man watching from the saloon's batwing doors. Tall and broad-shouldered, with pale eyes that seemed to catalog every movement on the street. When those eyes met Cashin's, the man's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, but felt more like a threat. Cowboy's hand instinctively moved to the Colt at his hip. In his 28 years, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that Cordelia Thorne and her daughter were in more danger than a simple request for boot polishing money could explain. He pocketed the coin, watching as the pale-eyed man disappeared back into the saloon's shadows. Something was very wrong in Millbrook. 3 days passed before Cashin saw Cordelia Thorne again. He'd been staying at the Millbrook Inn, ostensibly waiting for his business partner to arrive with a cattle shipment, but truthfully unable to shake the image of those bruises or the terror in little Bexley's eyes. He found Cordelia at dawn, drawing water from the town well with movements that spoke of barely contained pain. Her left shoulder sat lower than her right, and she favored her right leg as she worked the rope and pulley. "Mrs. Thorne." He approached slowly, hands visible, the way he might approach a spooked horse. She spun toward him, water bucket clattering against the well's stone rim. In the pale morning light, he could see fresh marks on her throat, finger-shaped bruises that made his jaw clench. Mr. Hartwell. She knew his name, though he'd never given it. In a town like Millbrook, strangers were catalogued and discussed. over every meal. Heavy bucket for someone with an injured shoulder. Cordelia's chin lifted with defiant pride. I manage just fine. I'm sure you do. Cashin moved to the well's opposite side, giving her space while making it clear he wouldn't be easily dismissed. Your daughter mentioned nightmares. I've had my share of those. Something flickered across Cordelia's features. A moment of vulnerability quickly shuddered. Bexley talks too much. She talks like a child who's seen things no child should see. He kept his voice gentle, but let steel creep into the edges. Same way you move like a woman who's been hurt by someone who should protect her. Cordelia's hands stilled on the well rope. Around them, Millbrook was beginning to wake smoke curling from chimneys. The distant sound of the blacksmith's hammer, a rooster crowing somewhere beyond the church. You don't know anything about my situation, Mr. Hartwell. I know the man. Watching us from the hotel window has been keeping track of everyone you talked to since I arrived. Cashin didn't look toward the building, but he'd felt those pale eyes on them since he'd approached the well. I know you jump every time a door slams and your little girl asks strangers for coins to buy medicine for your nightmares. Tears gathered in Cordelia's eyes, but her voice remained steady. Barnabas is my husband. Whatever happens between us is not your concern. Barnabas. The name tasted like ash in Cashin's mouth. He's the one who gave you those marks on your throat? Cordelia's hand flew to her neck, pulling her shawl higher. I fell down the stairs. Stairs that grabbed you by the throat and shook you? The water bucket slipped from Cordelia's grip, hitting the ground with a metallic clang that echoed across the square. Water spread in dark patches across the dirt, and she stared at it as if seeing her life spilling away. He wasn't always like this, she whispered. When we married, he was different. But the drinking, the gambling debts, the shame of losing our farm, She looked up at Cashin with eyes that held years of accumulated pain. He says if I ever leave, he'll find me. And Bexley. He says, there's nowhere we could run that he wouldn't find us. Cashin crouched, retrieving the bucket. As he handed it back, his fingers brushed hers, and he felt her flinch at the unexpected gentleness. There are places, he said quietly. People who help women in your situation. My sister runs a boarding house in Sacramento. Good people there. People who don't ask too many questions about the past. You don't understand. Cordelia's voice broke. Last week, when I tried to take Bexley to visit my sister in the next county, he locked us in the root cellar for 2 days. No food, no water, no light. Bexley still wakes up screaming about the dark. The medicine for nightmares. Now Cashin understood what Bexley had meant. Mrs. Thorne, Cordelia, you can't live like this. Neither can your daughter. I can't risk her life on the kindness of a stranger. From across the square came the sound of heavy boots on wooden planks. Barnabas Thorne stepped from the hotel, his pale eyes fixed on his wife with predatory intensity. Time's up, Cordelia. Breathed, the bucket trembling in her grip. But as Barnabas approached, Cashin stepped smoothly between them, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Morning, Thorne. Fine day for conversation. The tension in Millbrook's town square stretched taut as a bowstring. Barnabas Thorne stood 6 feet from his wife, but Cashin Hartwell's broad shoulders blocked his path like a mountain had sprouted from the earth. Move aside, stranger. Barnabas's voice carried the soft menace of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I need to speak with my wife. Seemed like she was having a nice peaceful morning. Cashin's tone remained conversational, but his stance shifted almost imperceptibly, feet spread, weight balanced, ready. Hate to see that interrupted. What happens between a man and his wife ain't your concern. Funny thing about that. Cashin's gray eyes met Barnabas's pale ones without flinching. I've always been bothered by men who hurt women and children. Call it a character flaw. Behind him, Cordelia's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Cashin could feel her terror, like heat from a forge. Cordelia. Barnabas's voice softened into something that might have sounded loving to a casual observer. Come along now. Bexley's waiting for her breakfast. I'll bring the water, Cordelia whispered, stepping sideways to avoid both men. But as she passed Barnabas, he grabbed her wrist, the one already circled with bruises. The movement was swift, casual, and cruel. Cordelia bit back a cry of pain. Cashin's hand dropped to his Colt. Let her go. The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread across the square. A few early risers had stopped to watch, sensing drama but not yet understanding its nature. Barnabas smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. You threatening me, Drifter? Making an observation. You're hurting the lady. The lady is my wife. I'll touch her however I see fit. Cashin took a single step forward, and suddenly the space between the two men crackled with violence barely held in check. Not while I'm watching. For a moment, Millbrook held its breath. Then Barnabas released Cordelia's wrist with deliberate slowness, his smile widening. Interesting. He looked Cashin up and down as if cataloging weapons and weaknesses. Very interesting indeed. His gaze shifted to Cordelia, who was cradling her injured wrist. We'll continue our conversation at home, dear wife, where we have privacy. The threat was unmistakable. Whatever mercy Cashin's intervention had bought would be paid for later. With interest as Barnabas walked away, whistling softly, Cordelia turned to Cashin with eyes full of despair. You've made it worse, she whispered. You don't know what he's capable of. Then tell me. Cordelia glanced around the square, noting the curious faces pretending not to watch. Not here. Tonight, after moonrise, the old mill by Willow Creek. But come armed, Mr. Hartwell, and be prepared to leave town immediately after. Before Cashin could respond, she was gone, hurrying toward the residential streets with her water bucket clutched against her chest. Like armor, the rest of the day passed with agonizing slowness. Cashin tried to occupy himself with mundane tasks, checking on his horse, writing letters, cleaning his weapons. But his mind kept returning to the bruises on Cordelia's throat and the terror in little Bexley's eyes as evening approached. He noticed an increase in activity around Barnabas Thorne's house, a modest two-story structure on Elm Street. Men came and went, their conversations too quiet to overhear, but their demeanor suggesting business both serious and illicit. When full darkness fell, Cashin made his way to the old mill. The building sat beside Willow Creek like a sleeping giant, its water wheel still and ghostly in the moonlight. He arrived early, positioning himself where he could watch the approaches while remaining hidden. Cordelia appeared just after midnight, moving like a woman afraid of her own shadow. She wore a dark cloak that made her nearly invisible against the night, and she carried a small bundle clutched to her chest. Mr. Hartwell? She whispered into the darkness. Here. He stepped into view, noting how she started at his voice despite expecting him. I shouldn't be here. If he finds out she shuddered. He won't find out. Tell me what I need to know. Cordelia looked toward the mill wheel, gathering strength from somewhere deep inside herself. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite her trembling hands. Barnabas isn't just a drunkard and a brute. He's been smuggling stolen cattle through Millbrook for the past year, using threats and violence to keep the townspeople quiet. The sheriff's in his pocket, bought and paid for with blood money. That explains the men at your house today, his partners. They're planning something big, a cattle drive worth more than most people see in a lifetime. But Barnabas has been skimming from them, and they're getting suspicious. She clutched the bundle tighter. He told me if anything goes wrong, he'll kill me and Bexley rather than let us fall into their hands. He says we know too much. What do you know? Everything. Names, dates, routes, payoffs. Barnabas drinks too much and talks even more. He's been using me as his record keeper, making me write down details because he's too drunk most nights to remember them himself. The bundle she carried suddenly made sense. You have proof. Everything. Enough to hang them all, if it ever reached the right authorities. But that's why we can never be free, Mr. Hartwell. Dead women tell no tales. In the distance, a wolf howled, or perhaps it was just the wind through the trees. Either way, it raised the hair on Cashin's neck. There's another way, he said slowly. An idea beginning to form. Dawn broke gray and cheerless over Millbrook, matching Cashin's mood as he sat in the inn's dining room, pushing eggs around his plate, while his mind worked through the dangerous plan taking shape. The evidence Cordelia had shown him was damning pages of meticulous records detailing cattle thefts, payoffs, and the network of corruption that stretched from Millbrook to 3 surrounding counties. But the very completeness of those records also represented a death sentence for Cordelia and Bexley if discovered. You look like a man contemplating his own funeral. Cashin looked up to find a stranger settling into the chair across from him. Lean man with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore a badge, but not one Cashin recognized. Deputy U.S. Marshal Jeremiah Knox, the man said, extending his hand. Been tracking a cattle rustling operation for the better part of 6 months. Trail led me to your little town here. Cashin felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. Cashin Hartwell, just passing through. Interesting timing. Knox signaled the waitress for coffee. See, I've been watching Barnabas Thorne and his associates for weeks now. And yesterday, someone started stirring up their nest. Making them nervous. Making them sloppy. Can't imagine what that has to do with me. Knox smiled, the expression holding more warmth than Cashin expected. Nothing, I'm sure. But I thought you might like to know that Thorne's planning to move. His operation tonight. Big cattle drive heading west toward the territorial border. If someone wanted to see justice done, tonight would be the time. The marshal's meaning was clear, even wrapped in careful language. He knew about Cordelia's situation, had probably been watching the house, waiting for the right moment to act. Hypothetically, Cashin said slowly, what would happen to someone caught in the middle of such an operation? Someone who might have information, but no way to escape? Hypothetically? Knox's eyes grew serious. That someone would need to be somewhere very safe when the shooting starts. And they'd need to be prepared to testify when the dust settles. And after the testimony? Federal marshals have been known to help witnesses relocate. New names, new lives, far from anyone who might wish them harm. It was more than Cashin had dared hope for. But it also meant putting Cordelia and Bexley in the middle of a gunfight between federal agents and desperate criminals. The family you're thinking about, Knox continued quietly. They have a little girl? Cashin nodded. Children shouldn't have to live in fear. Makes them grow up too fast, takes something from them that can never be given back. The marshal's words carried the weight of personal experience. Cashin found himself trusting the man despite the danger of doing so. How many men does Thorne have? 8 that I've counted, plus himself. My team is 5 strong, all experienced. But we'll need someone inside, someone who can get the family to safety before the shooting starts. Outside the inn's windows, Millbrook was coming to life. Shopkeepers opening their doors, women heading to market, children playing in the streets. All of them living under the shadow of Barnabas Thorne's operation, whether they knew it or not. There's something else, Cashin said. The evidence. Written records of everything. Knox's eyebrows rose. Where? Hidden but accessible. It would seal the case. And the woman who kept those records? Wants her daughter to grow up free. The two men sat in silence for a moment, each understanding what the other was really saying. Then Knox pulled out a pocket watch, checking the time. Sun sets at 7:30. Thorne's moving his cattle at 9, using the cover of darkness. My men will be in position by 8, he met Cashin's eyes. If someone wanted to help a family disappear before the fireworks start, they'd need to move them by 7. And if that someone got caught, then he'd better be fast with a gun and faster with his feet. Knox stood to leave, then paused. Millbrook's going to be a different place come morning. Safer. A place where children can play without fear and women can walk to the well without looking over their shoulders. After the marshal left, Cashin sat alone with his cold coffee and racing thoughts. The plan was dangerous, but it offered something neither he nor Cordelia had dared dream of: a real chance at freedom. He spent the day making preparations, checking his weapons, planning routes, and observing the increased activity around the Thorne house. As afternoon faded to evening, he noticed Cordelia hanging laundry behind her house, moving with the careful precision of someone trying to appear normal while fighting panic. When their eyes met across the distance, he touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that could have been casual courtesy but carried the weight of a promise. Tonight, the nightmare would end, but first, they had to survive it. The clock in Millbrook's church tower chimed 6:30 as Cashin approached the Thorne house from the alley behind Elm Street. Shadows stretched long across the town, and the air carried the evening sounds of a community settling into night, mothers calling children inside, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of rocking chairs on porches. Cordelia's signal came exactly as planned, a single candle in the kitchen window, flickering 3 times before being extinguished. Barnabas and his men were at the saloon, finalizing plans for the night's work, giving them a narrow window of opportunity. Cassin slipped through the back gate and across the small garden, where Cordelia grew vegetables to stretch their meager funds. The kitchen door opened before he could knock. Thank God, Cordelia breathed, her face pale but determined. I was afraid you'd changed your mind. Never crossed it. He stepped inside, noting the packed bags waiting by the door. Bexley? Upstairs, gathering her treasures. I told her we were going on an adventure. Smart woman, shielding her daughter from the truth while preparing her for flight. Cashin's respect for Cordelia grew even deeper. The records? Cordelia moved to the kitchen hearth, working loose a stone that looked identical to all the others. Behind it lay a wrapped oilcloth package. Every transaction, every name, every detail Barnabas ever made me write down. As she handed him the package, their fingers brushed, and this time she didn't flinch away. The trust in that simple contact meant more to Cashin than she could know. Mama? Bexley's voice drifted down from upstairs. Is the nice cowboy here? Coming. Sweetheart. Cordelia looked at Cashin with eyes that held both hope and terror. If something goes wrong, nothing's going wrong. His voice carried absolute conviction, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. Marshal Knox and his men are good at their job. We'll be long gone before the trouble starts. They climbed the narrow stairs to find Bexley sitting on her bed, a small cloth bag in her lap. Inside, Cashin glimpsed a corn-husk doll, a few coins, and what looked like a pressed flower. Are we really going on an adventure? Bexley asked, her young voice mixing excitement with uncertainty. The biggest adventure of your life, Cashin told her, meaning every word. But we need to be very quiet, like we're sneaking past sleeping. Dragons. Bexley's eyes widened with delight at the game. Can I ride your horse? Absolutely. But first, we need to get to where the horses are waiting. The plan was simple, too simple, perhaps, but sometimes the direct approach worked best. They would slip out through the back of the house, make their way through the alleys to the abandoned barn where Cashin had hidden 3 horses, then ride hard for the territorial border where Marshal Knox's reinforcements waited. They made it as far as the garden gate before everything went sideways. Well, what have we here? Barnabas Thorne stepped out of the shadows beside the chicken coop, and Cashin's blood turned to ice. The man wasn't supposed to be here, should have been at the saloon with his men, drunk and distracted by final preparations. Evening, dear wife. Barnabas's voice carried deadly calm. Taking a stroll with our daughter and her new friend? Cordelia instinctively pushed Bexley behind her, but the girl was too small to be completely hidden. Barnabas, please what? Please don't notice that you're carrying traveling bags? Please don't see that your cowboy friend has enough ammunition on his belt to fight a small war? His pale eyes glittered in the moonlight. Did you really? Think I wouldn't notice you skulking around like a thief in your own home? Let them go, Thorne. Cashin's hand moved slowly toward his Colt. Your quarrel's with me. My quarrel? Barnabas laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. My quarrel is with a wife who thinks she can steal from me, run from me, take my daughter and my secrets to God knows where. I'm not stealing anything, Cordelia said, her voice stronger than Cashin expected. I'm saving my daughter from growing up afraid. Fear keeps people in line, keeps them grateful for what they have. Fear isn't living, Barnabas. It's just existing. Something in her tone seemed to enrage him. His hand shot out, grabbing Cordelia's arm and yanking her away from Bexley. The little girl cried out, reaching for her mother. That was when Cashin drew. The Colt cleared leather faster than thought, the barrel leveling on Barnabas's chest. Let her go. For a heartbeat, the tableau held Barnabas gripping his wife's arm, Cordelia protecting her daughter, Cashin with death in his eyes and steady hands. Then Barnabas smiled. You know what the problem is with heroes, Hartwell? They always think they're the only ones with guns. The sound of multiple hammers being cocked came from the darkness around them. 5 men stepped into the moonlight, weapons trained on Cashin. From every direction. My men never actually went to the saloon, Barnabas continued conversationally. Funny thing about trust, it's a luxury I've never been able to afford. The moonlight painted everything in silver and shadow as Cashin found himself surrounded, his Colt suddenly feeling inadequate against 5 rifles pointed at his heart. Bexley whimpered behind her mother's skirts, and Cordelia's face had gone white with despair. Now then, Barnabas said, his grip tightening on his wife's arm. Let's discuss the situation like civilized people. You're going to drop that pistol, Mr. Hartwell, and then we're all going to have a conversation about boundaries and consequences. Cashin's mind raced, calculating angles and odds. 5 men, spread wide, experienced fighters by their stance and the casual way they held their weapons. Even if he managed to take down Barnabas, the others would cut him down before he could protect Cordelia and Bexley. The gun, Hartwell. Slowly Cashin bent to place his Colt on the ground. As he did, his fingers brushed against something in his pocket. The coin Bexley had pressed into his palm 3 days ago. Such a small thing, but it reminded him of the child's faith that someone, somewhere, would help them escape this nightmare. Excellent. Now kick it away. Cashin complied, the weapon sliding across the packed earth to rest near the chicken coop. But as it moved, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. A shadow that didn't belong, a shape moving behind the barn with the fluid grace of a man trained in stealth. Marshal Knox was early. Here's what's going to happen, Barnabas continued, still holding his wife like a shield. My dear Cordelia is going to tell me where she hid my business records. Then you're going to walk out of Millbrook and never come back. And if you're very, very lucky, I might let you leave with all your parts attached. And if she doesn't tell you? Cashin asked. playing for time while more shadows seemed to materialize in his peripheral vision. Barnabas's smile turned vicious. Then little Bexley learns what happens to children whose mothers make poor choices. The threat hung in the air like poison. Cordelia made a sound like a wounded animal, and Cashin felt rage build in his chest like steam in a boiler. "You touch that child, and you'll what?" "You're hardly in a position to make threats." But even as Barnabas spoke, his confidence seemed to waver slightly. Perhaps he too had noticed that the night around them had grown very quiet, no insects chirping, no night birds calling, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath. "The records, Cordelia, now." They single quotes, . Cordelia's voice broke. "They're in the kitchen, behind a loose stone by the hearth." "Much better. Jenkins, go check." One of the gunmen started toward the house, but before he'd taken 3 steps, voice cut through the darkness with the authority of federal law. "U.S. Marshals, drop your weapons." The night erupted in chaos. Marshal Knox's men emerged from cover positions around the house, rifles trained on Thorne's gang from multiple angles. The careful trap Barnabas had laid suddenly became one in which he was caught, but desperate men do desperate things. Instead of surrendering, Barnabas yanked Cordelia harder against him, producing a knife from his boot and pressing it to her throat. "Back off, or I open her up like a Sunday chicken," Bexley screamed, the sound piercing through the tense standoff. One of Thorne's men, nervous and trigger-happy, swung his rifle toward the child. Cashin moved without conscious thought, diving toward his discarded Colt while shouting, "Down!" Gunfire exploded across the garden. Muzzle flashes lit the night like deadly lightning as federal agents and criminals exchanged lead. Cashin's hand closed around his pistol grip just as the gunman targeting Bexley fired. The bullet meant 4. The child took Cashin high in the shoulder, spinning him but not stopping his draw. His return shot took the man's center mass, dropping him instantly. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Cashin saw Marshal Knox advancing on Barnabas, who still held Cordelia at knife point. But the outlaw's attention was divided between the federal agents and his immediate hostages, giving Cordelia the opening she needed. With desperate courage born of maternal fury, she drove her elbow back into Barnabas's ribs, hard enough to break his grip and send the knife spinning away into the darkness. As she broke free, Knox's rifle spoke once. Definitively. Barnabas Thorne crumpled to the ground and moved no more. The gunfight lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Thorne's men were dead, 2 wounded and disarmed, and the rest of the gang had vanished into the night like the cowards they'd always been. Cashin sat propped against the garden fence, Cordelia kneeling beside him while Marshal Knox's medic worked on his shoulder wound. Bexley clung to her mother with fierce determination, as if afraid that letting go might cause her to disappear. "It's over," Knox said, approaching with the oilcloth package of records in his hands. "This evidence will round up the rest of the operation within a month." "What happens now?" Cordelia asked, her voice still shaky from shock and adrenaline. Now you and your daughter start a new life wherever you choose. The federal government takes care of its witnesses, Mrs. Thorne, and heroes," he added, nodding toward Cashin, "recover from their wounds in comfortable surroundings." Bexley looked up at Cashin with eyes bright with tears and something that might have been hero worship. "Does it hurt bad, mister?" "Not so bad that I can't keep." "A promise," Cashin replied, fishing in his pocket for the coin she'd given him. "I believe this belongs to you." But as he held it out, Bexley shook her head solemnly. "Keep it, for luck. Mama says we're going to need lots of luck in our new adventure." Cordelia met his eyes over her daughter's head, and in her gaze Cashin saw something that made his wounded shoulders suddenly matter much less, the look of a woman who'd found not just safety, but perhaps something more, The nightmare was over. The adventure was just beginning. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through lace curtains into the kitchen of a small house on the outskirts of Sacramento. Cashin Hartwell stood at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes while trying not to aggravate the lingering stiffness in his left shoulder. Behind him, he could hear the sound of feminine laughter, a sound that still made his heart skip after all these weeks of hearing it daily. "Mama, tell him the funny story about the chicken and the traveling preacher," Bexley demanded from her seat at the kitchen table, where she was supposed to be working on her letters but seemed more interested in entertaining herself with tales of their old life in Millbrook. "Which one?" asked Cordelia, now Cordelia Hartwell, as of 2 weeks ago, as she entered the kitchen with her dark hair braided, simply, and her face holding the kind of peace that came from sleeping without nightmares. There were so many chickens, and that poor preacher did seem to attract trouble. The one where a certain little girl eats her breakfast before it gets cold," Cashin interrupted with mock sternness, sliding a plate of golden pancakes in front of Bexley. "School starts in an hour, and Mrs. Peterson doesn't accept 'I was too busy talking' as an excuse for being late." Bexley giggled, cutting into her pancakes with the serious concentration of a child who'd learned not to waste food. The nightmares that had once plagued her sleep had faded over the months, replaced by dreams of horses and adventures and the security of knowing she was truly safe. As Cashin served Cordelia her breakfast, their hands brushed a casual contact that still sent warmth racing through him. She looked up with a smile that held all the gratitude and love he could have asked for. "Any word from Marshall Knox?" she asked, settling into her chair beside Bexley. "Letter came yesterday. The last of Barnabas's associates were rounded up in Colorado Territory. The judge sentenced the ringleaders to 20 years hard labor." Cashin poured coffee for himself and Cordelia, then sat across from his new family. "It's truly over." "Good," Cordelia said simply, but he could see the relief in her eyes. Even here, hundreds of miles from Millbrook, with new names and a new life, she'd carried the fear that somehow the past might reach out to reclaim them. "And the town?" she asked. "Thriving, according to Knox. New sheriff, new mayor, businesses. Growing. Turns out people are much more productive when they're not afraid of being murdered in their beds." Bexley looked up from her pancakes, syrup on her chin. "Are we ever going to visit Millbrook again?" Cashin and Cordelia exchanged a look over the child's head, the kind of wordless communication that had developed between them over months of shared decisions and mutual trust. "Maybe someday," Cordelia said gently. "When you're older, if you want to see where you were born. Will you show me the old mill where you and Papa Cashin had your secret meeting?" Papa Cashin was Bexley's own invention, a title that had emerged naturally as she'd grown to love the man who'd risked everything to save her and her mother. Cashin had never asked her to call him that, but the first time she'd used it 3 months ago, when he'd been teaching her to ride, he'd nearly fallen off his horse with emotion. "Maybe," he said now, reaching across to wipe syrup from her chin with his napkin. "But first you need to finish growing up here, in a place where little girls can be little girls instead of worrying about grown-up troubles." After Bexley left for school, skipping down the tree-lined street with her leather satchel bouncing against her hip, Cashin and Cordelia lingered over their coffee, enjoying the quiet intimacy of a married couple with time to simply be together. "I received a letter from my sister yesterday," Cordelia said, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "She's finally gotten word about what happened in Millbrook. She wants to visit. How do you feel about that?" Cordelia considered the question seriously, as she did most things. Nervous. Excited. Afraid she'd see how much I've changed and not recognize the woman she grew up with. "You have changed," Cashin agreed. "You're stronger, happier, free." "I'm loved," she said, simply meeting his eyes across the table. "Really, truly loved for the first time in my adult life." Sometimes I wake up and can't believe it's real." Cashin reached across the table, taking her hand in his calloused fingers. "It's real. We're real. This life we've built, it's ours." "I never thought I could have this," she whispered. "A home where I'm not afraid. A husband who treats me like a partner instead of property. Watching my daughter laugh without looking over her shoulder. You deserve all of it and more." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked across the breakfast table, watching dust motes dance in the morning sunlight. Outside, Sacramento was coming to life, the sounds of commerce and community, the safe, predictable rhythms of a city where law meant something and justice wasn't for sale. "I should start on the washing," Cordelia said eventually, though she made no move to release his hand. "The washing can wait a few more minutes. Mrs. Chun is expecting her order by noon." Mrs. Chun has been taking in laundry for 30 years. She knows how long it takes. Cordelia laughed. The sound still surprised her sometimes, coming so easily. Now when for years it had felt impossible. "You're trying to distract me from my work. Is it working?" "Maybe a little." They were interrupted by a knock at the front door, not the urgent hammering of trouble, but the polite rap of a neighbor or friend. Cashin rose to answer it, returning moments later with an envelope bearing an official seal. "From the territorial governor's office," he said, settling back in his chair to break the wax seal. Cordelia watched his face as he read, noting the way his eyebrows climbed higher with each line. "What is it?" "A job offer. They want me to serve as a federal marshal, working with Knox's unit to clean up cattle rustling operations throughout the territory." "That sounds dangerous. It would mean travel. Weeks away from home sometimes." Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, considering. The old Cordelia, the frightened woman who'd lived in Millbrook, would have begged him not to take risks, not to leave her and Bexley vulnerable. But this new version of herself, the woman who'd found courage enough to keep records that helped destroy a criminal enterprise, had different thoughts. "Is it work you'd find meaningful?" she asked. "Very much so. There are other women out there. Other children, living in fear because men like Barnabas think they can take whatever they want." "Then you should do it." Cashin looked surprised. "Just like that?" "Just like that." She stood, moving around the table to settle in his lap, her arms around his neck. "I married a hero, Cashin Hartwell. I can't very well ask him to stop being one just because it might worry me." "You're extraordinary," he murmured against her hair. "I'm ordinary. But I'm finally free to be ordinarily happy, and that makes all the difference." They held each other in the morning sunlight, two people who'd found something precious in the most unlikely circumstances. Outside, a mockingbird began its elaborate song, cycling through melodies borrowed from other birds but somehow making them entirely its own, like their love, Cashin thought. Built from pieces of pain and hope, trust and courage, but somehow becoming something entirely new and entirely theirs. "There's one condition," Cordelia said after a while. "Name it." "You come home. Always. No matter what." "Always," he promised, and sealed the vow with a kiss that tasted of coffee and pancakes and the sweetest kind of forever. When Bexley returned from school that afternoon, she found her parents working together in their small garden. Cordelia planting vegetables while Cashin repaired the fence, both of them talking and laughing like the best kind of friends. The little girl paused at the garden gate, taking in the scene with the wisdom of a child who'd known both fear and safety. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the coin Cashin had tried to return to her months ago, the same coin she'd offered him to polish his boots in what now felt like another lifetime. She'd been carrying it ever since, a talisman of luck and hope. But looking at her parents, at their home, at the life they'd built together, Bexley realized she didn't need luck anymore. She had something better. She had love. She had safety. She had a family that would never let fear rule their choices again. With a smile, she buried the coin in the soft earth beside the garden gate, planting it like a seed that had already grown into everything she could have wished for. Then she ran to join her parents, her laughter bright as silver in the afternoon sun, completely and utterly free.